Good morning, everybody. Excuse me. I hope you're all well. We're here today to talk about the fiction passages on the SAT and the ACT. First, just a couple words about what's going on here. We have online tutoring that you can access for the SAT and the ACT, and also for academic subject tutoring, especially for those of you taking AP exams, which I know I've just gotten a little weird by moving online. So if you're worried about that, we have tutoring for the AP exams. And for the SAT and ACT tutoring, they can be leading up to the June tests, which are somehow right around the corner. I'm not really sure how we're halfway through April, but time works weirdly nowadays. And they're available any time of the day, even if you're in a different country. So you would definitely want to consider that. It will pay off when you consider how much you'll go up on the SAT and ACT. But we also have our SAT and ACT classes online, which I've linked to below. And so today we'll be talking about the reading and stuff. And so when you take a class, you're getting that information along with much, much more all at once, and you get to interact with the teacher. So you can get personalized instruction. Okay, so the fiction passages are on the SAT and the ACT. On both tests, they're the first passage. So as soon as you open the reading section, first passage is always a piece of fiction. Now, I have a lot of rules for how to handle the essays, which, make up about 3/4 to 4/5 of the actual reading section. So the question is then, why do we have to talk about the fiction passages? Are they somehow different? And the answer is they are. They are different from the essays. So I've outlined a few points here as to how and why that is. They're excerpts from large short stories or novels. So basically, you're reading something that was taken out of a larger piece. Why is it important to know that? Who cares? Well, there's a reason we want to pay attention to that. That means that since it's an excerpt, it might not feel complete. It might feel like you were changing the channel and all of a sudden you caught 5 minutes of a movie. So it'll be a little awkward. And if you don't know that going in, it's easy to be intimidated. But if you do, you're ahead of the game. The fiction passages don't operate with the traditional essay structure of thesis, examples, and a conclusion. Now, that's not to say that, you aren't introduced to things at the beginning and that there's kind of a concluding thought at the end. But it doesn't have that traditional essay structure that you were so used to. They can definitely be more time-consuming passages. When you're reading an essay, you can pay attention to the intro, topic sentences, conclusion. You can sort of skim the rest. Fiction passages don't work quite as cleanly. Because of that, it can sometimes seem a little harder to know where to skip around. Therefore, for most students, reading the fiction passage tends to be the most time-consuming. And lastly, their format is a little less predictable, which goes along with the fact that they don't operate with a traditional essay structure. You think of any story, book, movie, TV show, each one's a bit different. Sometimes, they play around with interesting narrative techniques. Same thing here. You don't quite know what you're going to get, which makes it more intimidating. But just because things are different doesn't mean you can't figure out ahead of time what you should look for. So when you're reading the fiction passages, you want to read with a purpose. In other words, you want to think to yourself, what do I have to look for so that I can answer the questions? Reading with a purpose also helps keep you focused. If you're focused, you read better and you retain better. I'm sure all of us have had the experience of having to read a book or an essay for school, and you go through about 3 pages and you pause and you say to yourself, I have no idea what those last 3 pages were about, because they were boring, and so your mind blanked, and while your eyes were moving across the page, you weren't processing anything. Happens to me too. If you read with a purpose, that happens a lot less. So when you're reading and you're looking for specific things, that can really help. Now, some people, when I mention this, say, oh, so Donald, isn't it a good idea then to read the questions ahead of time? Unfortunately, it's not. There's 10 questions, so it's hard to remember all of them, and you're time limited. But by working with, a teacher or a tutor, oftentimes you can figure out ahead of time what the questions will be about. And I listed kind of very general ideas to look for: characterization, conflict, whether the conflict resolves, and dialogue. That's what I'm paying attention to when I read a fiction passage. So just very briefly on each. Characterization is a 1 sentence or 2 description about how you would summarize a character. Conflict is the problem in the story. Now look, conflict can be exciting or it can be kind of quiet. For example, what's interesting is we're actually in a conflict right now. I know something about the SAT and ACT, and I'm trying to make sure you do. You want to know something about the SAT and ACT, and you're hoping that happens. That is a conflict. It's not a negative conflict, but it is something that we're trying to overcome. But that's not a very exciting conflict, right? Like nobody would record a movie of our day being like, oh, wow, yeah, we got to watch that. But if I was doing this and all of a sudden, you heard an explosion in the background, then you'd be like, okay, that's a more exciting conflict. Unfortunately, these standardized tests are not really going to go with the exciting conflict. They're going to keep it pretty dull. You do want to know whether the conflict resolves. It might not. Because, as we said before, it's an excerpt. There's no guarantee that things are going to end. So the story could conclude, 30 pages after the excerpt ends. Therefore, in the excerpt that you're reading, there's no resolution to the conflict. In other passages, there is a resolution to the conflict. And if there's a resolution to the conflict, there will be a question about it. If there's no resolution, sometimes there's a question about whether there's a resolution. I've seen that too. And the last thing I want to pinpoint is dialogue. Dialogue, if it appears in a passage, is always key. A lot of passages don't have much in the way of dialogue, but if they do, it's important because dialogue reveals plot and characterization. Unless you're writing a comedy, in which case it's for jokes, dialogue really is pointless unless it's revealing something about the story or something about characterization. So whenever you see dialogue, remember it's key and it's there for a reason. And that's something to focus in on. So what will the questions be about? Most of the things we were just discussing. Characterization is going to come up in questions. Conflict, the resolution or lack thereof, and the point of view. What do I mean by point of view? First person, third person, omniscient, questions like that. They will sometimes ask. And then word usage, which I believe my peer Kevin discussed the other day, which is when you have those questions about what a word, quote unquote, most nearly means. That is very common in all sections, and it also appears in both fiction passages on the SAT and ACT. So definitely expect those. However, those are pretty similar to, the word usage questions are pretty similar to the essay questions, so it's not really a big deal with those because you're used to them from the other sections. The other 4 bullet points I put are really unique to the reading section. Now, unique does not mean harder, doesn't mean bad. It just means unique. It's a little bit different, but knowing stuff ahead of time is half the battle. So I have an example here of just the top of a reading passage, and this is from the ACT. And there's a couple things I wanted to point out. For instance, from the first sentence, when I finally told Taft Edison, I'm already able to tell you what the point of view is. I've got that covered. The conflict will probably come up within the first paragraph or two as well. For instance, here, he was telling him about the time he spent on the road with the band. It was an incredible summer transition job that I needed because I had to get cash. When I left home for college, my main musical involvement beyond listening and dancing to it was humming and whistling it. So I'm thinking that the conflict is going to be this guy playing in a band. And I've gotten that really just from the beginning. So you don't have to read extra deep into the passage to figure these things out. I don't want you viewing it as, a deep literature exercise. But there's something else I want to point out. Before the passage starts, it says, in the passage, the term stopgap gig refers to a temporary position as a member of a band. There's often small wording above a passage. Most of the time people skip over that. They're like, it's not going to be important. It can actually be very important. So you should always read that, even if it just looks like the copyright. Just knowing the title of a story can make a huge difference. And in some cases, they define something for you, as they do here. Most students don't read that, and this can lead to confusion, and it can lead to questions being wrong. So make sure to zero in on that, because it's putting you ahead of others. And then I just excerpted a few questions here. Why did I pick these questions? Because I wanted to make a point. Number 1, regarding the musical education of the narrator. Oh, that's a characterization question. Number 8, the narrator states what Taft Edison did after he told him about playing with the band. Oh, that's a characterization question about Edison. Ditto with number 7. The narrator suggests that Taft Edison differed from many others. How so? Well, that's characterization. The narrator most strongly implies that he was initially impressed as a result of what? That kind of borders on characterization and conflict. And then number 2, the 5th and 6th paragraphs primarily serve to do what? And if you look through each of those choices, it's something about Taft Edison. So if you're able to characterize Taft Edison, you're going to be able to get that question correct. So almost all of these questions dealt with knowing the characters, knowing how to characterize them to some extent. For instance, number 8, if you know that Taft Edison comes across as a very laid-back guy, you're going to be able to knock out G and H right away. So characterization is key. And then I said conflict kind of comes in number 6. So conflict is key as well. Now, point of view doesn't seem to come up at all, but it actually is in each question. Notice that each question discusses the narrator, which means the passage is likely in the first person. So picking up on the point of view when reading is also helpful here. Now here's the beginning of a fiction passage on the SAT. I want you to note something. Once again, there's small wording above it. In this one, there's quite a bit. Silas was a weaver and a notorious miser, but then the gold he had hoarded was stolen. Shortly after, Silas adopted a young child, Eppie, the daughter of an impoverished woman who had died suddenly. That's really important information. That's telling you a backstory that you would probably not get from the passage. So you definitely want to read that. Then when you start to read the passage, you're going to pick up on a conflict right away. In that first paragraph, you realize there's a conflict between his old life with the gold and his new life with the daughter that he adopted. So the conflict appears pretty quickly. And from there, you can figure out characterization. But if you look to the small wording, they've actually already keyed you in on characterization. This doesn't happen all the time. Not every passage offers you this helpful small wording, but many times they do. And if most students aren't looking at it, but you are, well, that's giving you an advantage over everybody else in the room. All right. A common complaint I get about the fiction passage is that it takes people the longest. So I want to speak on that. No one says you have to do it first. Nobody's threatening you and saying you need to do the first passage right away. And if somebody is threatening you like that, you should probably tell the proctor. Just because the first passage is the first thing you open up to doesn't mean you need to do it right away. As a matter of fact, there's no reason to do any of the reading passages in order. You should do them in the order of easiest to hardest. Leave the hardest one for last because that'll take you the longest. It doesn't make sense to do the most difficult passage first and then not have time for easier passages at the end. So a lot of people find the fiction passage to be the most difficult, especially on the ACT. You may want to consider saving it for last. But through practicing, you may discover there's another type of passage that you tend to dislike the most, in which case that one should be saved for last. But the only way you can figure that out is through practice. All right, so I hope you have a better idea of the fiction section. The fiction section is interesting because a lot of students don't go in having focused on it. They don't go in having considered it. They've been focusing on essays. And then they get to this fiction passage and they're a little thrown. Now I'm hoping you won't be thrown when you see it and you'll know what to look for. So if you enjoy these, we have Test Prep Time Plus every day, which is a longer section that goes into a specific topic. And you can find them on our website. They name the different topics we'll be covering each day. And it goes a little bit more in depth and longer than these sessions. And then we have our online self-paced program, which is currently discounted, which offers a lot of helpful information, including questions, answers, and answer explanations. All right, guys. I appreciate you stopping by this morning. I wish you all the best and stay healthy and wash your hands.